And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Steel Curtain Podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi, editor of SteelCurtain.com. And joining me, as always, is contributor Shayne Kubas. Shayne and I have been out for a couple of weeks now, but we're excited to get back into the podcast again. We took some vacation time, and we're rearing to go. It seems like we got back, Shayne, just in the nick of time here as we address some things that I'm sure fans will be interested in. Brandon Aiyuk has come back up in the news cycle once again. We're going to get to all of these trending topics, and then we're going to break down and tier rank some of the greatest receivers in Steelers history, some maybe not so great. And so I'm excited to get to that. That'll be our first time trying something like that. So stick with us for that. All right, Shayne, let's talk about Brandon Aiyuk here. This is not going away as much as we would maybe like it to at this point, because you and I have both written about this so many times. We've talked about this for probably hours together at this point. Brandon Aiyuk continues to be connected to the Pittsburgh Steelers, and it's making kind of more sense than ever. Like, this is a guy that's been rumored to the team in trade rumors since the beginning of the offseason. And now that he's officially requested a trade from the 49ers, that report just coming out this week, for Mike Garofalo of NFL Network, it seems like the chances are kind of rising again, and it's going to get Steelers fans talking. It's been the biggest talking point all offseason, this crazy hypothetical that might not even happen. But I know fans want that next step. Like, they want this move that's going to take this team to the next level. Is that Brandon Aiyuk? I know that we've hashed over this in the past. Like, at this point, Shayne, at this stage, now that the request to be traded has been official, would the 49ers be willing to go down maybe on the asking price for a disgruntled wide receiver? What would it take for this to get done between these two sides?
I think the difficult part, and I apologize, by the way, guys, if you hear a dog barking. I have a puppy, so just throwing that out there. I think the problem for the Niners at this point is, even if Aiyuk doesn't want to come back, right? He doesn't want to play for them anymore. He clearly is interested in finding a new home and getting paid there. I think for the Niners, you have to think about this in one of two ways. Either the maximum haul you can get, so that's probably draft picks, maybe a receiver back if there's one good enough to kind of just supplement that room. I know that they're probably happy with Samuel, and obviously they draft Pearsall, and they hope that he can be one of their three guys. They have Jennings still. That's great. Still probably not enough in the passing game, ideally, for what they're trying to accomplish. I think it's going to be a win now move if they do it. And I did see something earlier that the Raiders are interested, and they might flip Adams to them. And, Adams doesn't have any new money left on his deal. Like, they might be able to make that work for a year or two. That would be a great, win now situation. I don't know how much you get on top of Adams back. Aiyuk obviously younger, at this point, maybe even depending on who you ask, kind of creeping up on Adams' level, maybe possibly, especially as Adams gets older. That would make some sense, but it just kind of comes down to what are they looking for? Do they want just draft capital? Because, any team could theoretically give them draft capital if they have it. Or are they looking for, we're still going for Super Bowl this year, we want to get somebody back who will help us do that right now?
Yeah, this is the one, Shayne. This is the guy that Steelers fans can't let go. Like we've talked about, Cortland Sutton. Deebo Samuel is a name that the Steelers confirmed to have reached out to talk to the 49ers about during the draft. I mean, that was potentially for their second round pick there. They ended up taking Zach Frazier, but Deebo Samuel is in the discussion. There's been other names floating out there, but it keeps coming back to Brandon Aiyuk. And now that the trade request has been made official on his part, we don't know if John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan are going to be willing to oblige with that. And they don't really have any contractual obligation to do so. Like, they've got Aiyuk under the 5th-year option. They can franchise tag him. They can tag him a second time if they wanted to and felt that he was deserving, although the price obviously spikes when you do that. That's 3 more years of control potentially over their stud wide receiver. For a team that has made it to the Super Bowl twice in the last 5 years, made it to a conference championship game 4 times in the last 5 years, you would think that they'd want to hang on to that guy a little bit longer, even after investing more in the position of drafting Ricky Pearsall in the first round. I don't know what their mindset is. I don't know what Pittsburgh's mindset is. We do know, obviously, the Steelers have some level of interest in trading for a wide receiver because they've expressed that, and they've come out and said that they're open to exploring these options. And so I'll be interested to see if this gets explored further if we hear about any conversations between the two sides, because I think that obviously proves that it's pretty serious at that point. As of now, though, we're kind of just going to take it for what it is. It's more Brandon Aiyuk talk. We'll see if anything emerges from this. My opinion kind of all along, Shayne, has been I kind of want the Steelers to stand pat where they are right now. Because here's my worry. I think Brandon Aiyuk does make their football team better. I think it makes their offense better at a cost. If he costs you $30 million a year in a first round pick, that's not nothing. So that's something you have to factor in. You got a lot of players who are going to be free agents after the 2024 season. So that's one factor. Getting rid of draft capital is another factor. The biggest factor of them all, Shayne, though, is you very well might not have a quarterback. You might not have the future quarterback on your roster. And I can't help but think about like the 2019 season when the Steelers traded for Minkah Fitzpatrick just a couple games in. Minkah's a great player. They wouldn't take that trade back for anything because he was a 3-time All-Pro for them and could be potentially on that track, even enough accolades to be a Hall of Fame consideration player.
Yeah.
But that's draft capital that could have potentially been used on a quarterback in the late stages of Ben's career. Not that they would have gone that route anyway, knowing the Steelers and knowing how short-sighted they are. But at some point, you have to bite the bullet. You've got to trade up in the draft. You've got to get a quarterback. And if a 36-year-old Russell Wilson in 2025 is not going to cut it for you, or a Justin Fields who may or may not see the field much this year, you need a quarterback. And so that's my concern, Shayne, is if you make this move, if you're still not good enough with Brandon Aiyuk because of your quarterback play, which has been an issue for years now you don't have the draft capital and you don't have the cap space. You would have the cap space to get a rookie quarterback, but you wouldn't have the draft capital to go up and make the move for one. And so that would be my concern. I don't think they're there quite yet. I don't think that they're close enough to that contention window quite yet to pull that trigger on such a major blockbuster trade. I think that give one more year to prove where they are, where they stand. I mean, this is a team that's looking to avoid an 8-year drought without a playoff win. And so let's get a playoff win first. Let's show that you can make a push in the postseason. That's my thought on has yours changed at all, Shayne, regarding Brandon Aiyuk? Is this something that you're more open to doing now?
Not really. And the main reason you kind of talked about is just, I see two scenarios where if you're a team looking to add Aiyuk, that it makes a lot of sense to do so. Right. It's either you have nothing on offense, you're looking for that alpha guy that can help you have an identity on offense. Right. So teams that just don't have that type of player or don't even have a quarterback for that type of player. Right. But they just need something to get them, like a Patriots would make a ton of sense. Right. Yep. Where now they have a young quarterback, of course, ready to play, but might not play him early. But now you have a receiver in place for him. Right. The Steelers don't have a rookie in place. They don't have a veteran in place that you're comfortable with. You look at the Bengals, for example. They're choosing so far not to extend T. Higgins because they know they have to extend Jamar Chase. The Niners are dealing with the same thing where, Samuel is already on a kind of a big deal. Aiyuk wants an even bigger one because of all the deals that have been getting signed recently for receivers. And they don't know if they're willing to pay that because they may or may not decide to pay Brock Purdy. They have the defense they have to pay and are paying right now. At some point, having two receivers, because you have to remember in this consideration, Pickens probably isn't getting re-signed if you bring in Aiyuk because you're going to have to pay Aiyuk $30 million. And if Pickens stays on his track, he's going to get $30 million. Like, that's just kind of where the receiver market is. So you're trading essentially for one more established receiver for the event that you don't want to pay the guy that's already on your team. Because I don't think they'd pay both of them, right? Yep. It's just there's too many moving parts with that. If they had a rookie quarterback on his deal where they were comfortable with him, they thought he was the answer, he'd shown that, then this deal would make more sense. Because even if you lose one of them, whether it's Pickens or maybe Aiyuk doesn't stick around full time, you went for it, right? You had an opportunity to go for it. Right now, they're not in that situation. We have no idea what this offense is going to look like. We have no idea how good or bad it is going to be. I think there's too much unknown with this team to inject a player, even as good as Aiyuk is. Of course, he'll help. Will he help enough? That's what they have to consider there.
100%. And that is the biggest factor, Shayne. It's the one that people don't often talk about, but the Steelers do not have their quarterback in place for the future. I know a lot of people want to believe that they do, unless it's Justin Fields. It's not going to be Russell Wilson, because Wilson you're getting 1 or 2 years, I think, out of this guy at the most. Are you really going to sign a 36-year-old quarterback to a multi-year contract extension? I think that would be very unwise considering what we've seen from Russell Wilson over the past 3 seasons, even going back to his final year in Seattle. So get the quarterback in place first. show that you can be competitive and you can go to toe with some of these teams in the playoffs, which they haven't. They've been losing by multiple scores. I think at 21 points on average over the last 3 playoff losses. And so you got to be competitive when you get to the postseason. It's not enough to be a slightly above 500 team or just to barely get there and get bounced bad in the first round. You have to show that you can be somewhat competitive before you make a move that maybe jeopardizes your chances of getting that quarterback. And I think the problem with the Steelers, Shayne, over these past 5 or 6 years, everything has been so short-sighted. It's been, how can we give Ben Roethlisberger somebody to work with right now? Like, let's give him a Najee Harris. Let's do that kind of stuff. What can we do here and now, here and now? It's always been about the here and now. Even going back to 2019 with the Minkah Fitzpatrick trade, you're talking about how can I salvage my team with a here and now trade, even though my quarterback is on IR with the torn elbow. And so it's always about salvaging their season and keeping their head above water. It's never about capitalizing on a Super Bowl window. And I think that that's where my philosophy would be a little bit different if I was running the front office. And we'll see. Maybe it will be with the new front office heads here, Omar Khan and Andy Weidel. But I think let's let things play out. Let's kind of bypass this unless the asking price comes down and it gets very reasonable.
If it's reasonable, it's different. But even then, I think it's just, again, I don't think we're the right team to do it ultimately. And if it's cheap enough, then like it's going to be worth it no matter what, I guess. But again, I think some other team is going to be able to offer both more and it will make more sense for them, right? Like that's kind of what I think will ultimately happen here.
For sure. And you know that I'm a big Brandon Aiyuk fan. I think that he's really solid. I think he's good at catch point, good after the catch. But I would be a little bit worried. And the other factor I think too here is that I think 49ers are just like the best situation for any skill player. And I think when you remove him from that, and you remove him from that and put him with an Arthur Smith offense, he might not be as efficient as he was. He's probably not a guy that gets 11 yards a target. Like it's just not reasonable probably to expect that. But I do think he would obviously still be a very good football player. It just comes down to capital. So I think we've spent enough of that. It was like 13 minutes on Brandon Aiyuk. If you have a question about Aiyuk or if you want to interject, go ahead and drop it in the chat down here. We'd love to see what you have to say about that.
We do have one just basically agreeing with us, like the Steelers from John here. The Steelers aren't one receiver must move away from a trophy. Exactly. This is not the biggest problem on the roster. As much as receiver depth is an issue, it's not the biggest actual issue overall. So
the roster is getting much stronger on paper. There's no doubt. I mean, these last 2 draft classes, I think if they turn out as advertised, the Steelers consensusly, they had, I wrote articles about how they had the best overall draft grades. Take it for what you will. The guys have to prove themselves, obviously, on the field. But these last 2 drafts, I'm super encouraged by. And it's another reason why I wouldn't want to give up elite draft capital, because if you hit on those picks, you're talking about a player that's a fraction of the price that Aiyuk's going to be. And like you said, then you're swapping out Aiyuk for Pickens. And so you want to do what's best to get your team back into that Super Bowl window, not just what makes them maybe potentially a game better in this season. So if you disagree with us, drop it in there. I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. Shayne, the Steelers announced that they are hosting a joint practice with the Buffalo Bills. This is going to be, unfortunately, it comes one day after training camp is shut down at Latrobe, and this practice will be held at Acrisure Stadium in Pittsburgh, just 2 days before their preseason game against the Bills. Is there anything that you want to see from this? Like, I know that you and I probably won't be on hand there, but from the media's perspective, is there anything that you are wanting to see come out of this? Do you think things are going to get chippy at all? This is a rematch, obviously, of their blowout playoff loss against the Bills, 31-17. This is probably a good test for them, but I just don't know how much. It's probably honestly a better test than the preseason will be, because at least they'll be doing one-on-one drills, corners versus wide receivers. We'll get to test Josh Allen a little bit. But in the game, we can assume that they're probably not going to do anything. It'll be vanilla offenses. Allen won't play much. What are you looking to see from this practice? What do you want to come out of this practice?
Honestly, and I'm hoping we see a lot of this before this practice too, but I think obviously practicing against another actual team is going to be more of a test for this. What does Najee Harris look like in a slimmed down version of him? Because he clearly is. Like you would see in the videos of him, he's slimmed down. We're hoping that leads to more explosiveness and the ability to run in this kind of wide zone type of offense, outside zone. I just want to see like what does he look like with that size, because we've seen in the past like Le'Veon Bell obviously dropped a ton of weight after his college career and after his first year at the Steelers. We saw what that did for him. Now, am I expecting the same thing for Najee? No, I don't think he has quite the same level of overall talent that Bell had, but I am curious to see just, what does that look like in this offense where he's not going to be just the bruiser. Hopefully he has a little bit more to his game, hopefully, because that's going to determine, and, I'll talk about an article coming up probably this week that I'm working on right now. That's going to determine whether he's on the team after this year. There's a reason why his option wasn't picked up, and I think that was a big reason why.
Yeah, I think that's something that everybody's going to want to see this year. Obviously, Arthur Smith runs that wide zone. You need to be a little bit quicker, a little bit faster probably than he has been. So cutting down from like that 242 range, I think is definitely the right choice. We'll see how it plays out. John chimes in here again, says it will be chippy for sure. The practice,
it sure will.
Bills.
They always
all
are,
these joint practices. Doesn't matter what teams. Doesn't matter. It's never like in division, but it kind of doesn't matter. It just seems like these are always they always get chippy. And I'll be interested to see what happens. Obviously, Chase Claypool is going to be a story here, assuming that he makes it all the way through training camp on the Bills roster. We'll see if anything comes of that. His kind of reunion with the Steelers. Obviously, they played last year, and but yeah, I think that that's I want to see. I agree with John. I want to see the chippiness as well. What's going to transpire from this? I don't know how much detail we'll be able to get if we're not there on hand, Shayne, but maybe we'll see some clips. And that's probably going to be about the end of it. And we'll see these two teams play 2 days later in the preseason. All right, Shayne, John Rice Plumlee was just selected with the 3rd overall pick in the UFL draft. The USFL, XFL join forces, the UFL. So this means that he's potentially poached from the Steelers roster. I think it shows you, no disrespect to Plumlee, just how desperate this league is. If the 3rd overall pick in the draft is a 4th string NFL quarterback. And I hope that I hope the guy has a great career. I'm not going to make a big deal out of this because I didn't expect Plumlee to make the roster anyway. I think even beating out Kyle Allen would have been a chore because at least Allen has starting experience in the NFL. What do you make of this pick in the draft, Shayne? And being this is a spring league, Plumlee's still going to be with the Steelers all through training camp. I have no doubt about that. It's just a matter of if he doesn't make the roster, he's probably going to the UFL in the spring next year.
And honestly, again, like you said, no offense to him, I kind of viewed him as a UFL quarterback, right? Like this is the type of player that the UFL should be targeting. A big, athletic, like can play quarterback, but is really a great athlete. Like this is the type of player that I think could be, 1, very effective in the UFL because of his athleticism, and 2, a place where he can go and kind of maximize his skill set. And maybe one day that leads to like a Taysom Hill type of thing for him. I think people have kind of talked about that as a possibility for him. Obviously a little bit younger than Ethan Hill was coming out into the NFL, which kind of hurt his ability to develop. But this is where he should probably be. Like that's just the reality of it. And I hope that if he does end up going there, which I'm sure he will if he doesn't make the team, I hope he balls out and we see him come back to the NFL in some capacity. But I do think it makes sense for the UFL to target guys like him that just have this type of skill set and physical ability.
Yeah, he's made for the developmental league, the spring league, if you will. I think that's perfect for him. He's got a fallback plan if things don't work out. And if he weren't to make the practice squad, he's got an option there. And so he could be leaving the Steelers. It may not matter because we didn't expect him. Neither you or I don't think had him in any of our 53-man roster predictions. But it's worth noting today that he was just selected with the 3rd overall pick in the UFL draft. All right, Shayne, one more talking point for the trending news today before we get into our big tier ranking the wide receivers. And that is yesterday, Colin Cowherd ranked the top 10 head coaches in the NFL. I didn't get to see the criteria that he was using for that exactly.
Who knows with him, honestly?
Who knows? He said, there's been some questionable things in the past, but he has Mike Tomlin as the 5th best head coach in the NFL. He has him ranked over Kyle Shanahan, who's been to a Super Bowl, like we just said, 2 of the past 5 years, a conference championship game 4 of the past 5 years. My thing here is it's all about your perspective, Shayne. If we're looking at this on the entire scale of things, Tomlin deserves to be a top 5 coach. He's got the 2 Super Bowl wins, never had the losing season. His regular season record is obviously phenomenal. If we are ranking the top 5 or the top 10 head coaches heading into the 2024 season, then I do kind of have a beef with where this ranking is. The Pittsburgh Steelers have 3 playoff wins in the last 13 years. They've been smacked in those losses. They've lost by multiple scores on average during that time. And like we said, they're looking to avoid an 8-year drought without a postseason victory. I don't think that Tomlin, if we're just talking about who are the best coaches heading into the year this year, I don't know if he deserves to be in the top 10, dare I say. I want to see people chime in with it and get angry at me now, but the results have not been there. Now, here's one point that I want to raise, Shayne, and I'll let you give your rebuttal here if you disagree with me. Excuse me. Everybody likes to point out the fact that Tomlin hasn't had much to work with. He hasn't had the quarterbacks. His offensive coordinators haven't been good. You got to remember, Tomlin is largely responsible for this stuff. He hired Randy Fichtner. We had 2 years of Randy Fichtner. He hired Matt Canada. We had 3 years of Matt Canada. That's 5 years of bad offensive play. He was not willing, as much say as he had in the pre-draft process, he was not willing to make a preemptive move before Ben Roethlisberger was on his last legs and then some. They waited until the final minute when they were forced to draft a quarterback in 2022. Like, there were steps that you could have taken to prevent getting yourself in this state. Did he perform? Did his team overperform expectations? Yes. They did that with no offense. You did it in a year where you had Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges playing. You did it last year when you had Kenny Pickett, Mitch Trubisky, and Mason Rudolph playing. But we can't say that Tomlin isn't responsible for any of this either, because he's responsible for all the coaching hires. And him alongside Kevin Colbert in the past have been the two heads responsible for the draft process. And so, yes, Tomlin outperformed expectations at times, but he also was responsible for kind of putting the team in the state that they were in. And so I think if we were just ranking off of the past 5 years, Shayne, you can go back 10 years if you want to. The sample hasn't been that good because you're just not getting any postseason success at all. There's been coaches who have lost their jobs for far less. And that's why I question the 3-year extension. I wanted kind of the pressure to be on Tomlin this year.
Yeah.
Do you disagree with me with all this? And how are you viewing these rankings? Do you think it's the whole scale rankings or just rankings heading into this year?
So I looked at the list a little bit while you were talking, and I'll address, like, from what your perspective is. Like, if you're doing it going into 2024, I definitely understand him being closer to 10 or even below that than 5, because again, the results just really haven't been there for quite some time in terms of the high profile stuff, the playoff wins, Super Bowls. But it looks like, just based on Colin's list, obviously I don't know what's going through that man's head. I don't know if anyone ever does most of the time, but it seems like it's body of work is what he's looking at here, because Sean Payton is number 4. John Harbaugh is number 3, I think, right now. And he's obviously had a lot of playoff issues lately as well. Like, I think it seems it's mostly the overall body of work. And if we're doing overall body of work, I definitely understand him being close to 5. And I think more importantly, like, for me, it sounds like he's also kind of going off of just, like, what is your ability to coach a football team that is in front of you? Like, do you look at the roster you currently have? How good are you at coaching that roster? I think if we're going off of that, then Tomlin certainly is top 5, because every year it seems like his rosters aren't good enough to even win 9 games, and he always does. That's the issue with him, is like they cannot be bad enough for him to not coach them to 9 wins. But at the same time, he has not helped them be good enough to get past the 9 wins. Like, he hasn't helped in the player department, like the player acquisition side of things, who he's hiring as his coaches. So that's the issue. If we're just going coaching ability, like player to coach ability, of course he's in the top 5. That's the only reason that he's still been as good as he has been, despite some of the issues on the roster. But again, if we're looking at it from your perspective, of course it's not top 5 realistically over the last, like you said, 8 to 10 years. So based on Colin's list, the way he did it, I'm okay with him being at 5. Based on what we're talking about, it would definitely be closer to like the 10 to 15 range.
Yeah, and Shayne, because Sean Payton was also up there, and obviously he took a year off, things didn't go well in Denver last year. I would assume that his criteria was looking at the whole scope of things,
like the whole thing
in the career sample. But yeah, I mean, it's two totally opposite ends of the spectrum, because if you use the first half of Tomlin's career, it's awesome,
very different,
and probably only Bill Belichick is ahead of him, and maybe Sean Payton. Like, those would be the two. But outside of that, things have not been so great. And so I guess it's all about how you approach that there. I don't have a big issue with the rest of his names on the list, really, although I do have a soft spot for Shanahan. I think Shanahan's awesome. I think he is a great. He just hasn't gotten the Super Bowl win, but he's been there 3 times. He's been really close. It's been good.
I think what kills him for a lot of people is, to me, he's the greatest offensive mind of this generation, right?
Mm.
I think, Reed is obviously, he's been around so long that he has to be in consideration there. McVay himself is up there as well. But like just about like getting, like having a system in place that is so hard to deal with most of the time, it's Shanahan. But he personally, like his own decisions have made such a specifically bad like it has been so specifically bad in the wrong moments that it really tarnished. Like you look at when he was an offensive coordinator at the Falcons and throwing the ball for some reason when you're up 28-3, not to kill Falcons fans like dreams right now, or the Super Bowl losses where Garoppolo's out there throwing the ball when they have a good lead and he ends up throwing a pick because he's pressured. Like there's just been specific decisions that he's made in those big moments that have made his team falter, that have been a part of that. Whereas with Tomlin, it's more the stuff getting to that point. Like he's had trouble getting us there because of some of the stuff that he's probably influenced. But when we've been there, I've never really blamed him for a lot of the issues once we're actually in that position. It's more about getting us there to begin with. So it's a weird thing with him.
Yeah, for sure. And I think Shanahan's in-game decisions kind of like Mike Tomlin's clock management.
Yes, there you go. Yeah,
that's his kryptonite. So, all right, Shayne, let's move on. I'm excited about this next part. We are going to tier rank all of the best Steelers receivers and maybe some who haven't been so good. And so you're going to throw up some names here for us. We're going to slot them into tiers. If you guys are following us live here in the chat, please chime in with your thoughts. But Shayne and I will discuss these and we'll see where these players should be slotted. So Shayne, why don't you go ahead and start us off and explain what we're doing here?
Right. So we're making a tier list here. I'm sure many of you have seen like the tier list generators for years now. Like people have made YouTube videos about them. We're currently on YouTube Live doing it ourselves. Like people throw them up on Twitter. Like they're all over the place, right? So you've seen these before. And I have 20 names, 20 pictures specifically on the board here for us to go through. And I kind of have a lot of the older guys, especially on the bottom there, just so we can kind of go through them. I want to kind of start with those guys because I know for me especially, and even some of these guys for you, Tommy, we weren't really actually watching them live. Like we weren't watching these guys play. We know of them, of course. We know the history with a lot of these guys. And they do rank, especially some of them, very highly on like the career yards and touchdowns and stuff for the Steelers. But they are from kind of an era bygone for our standards, right? So, and then we have some modern guys, some guys who were really good, some guys who were not so good, as you can probably see if you guys can see the pictures a little bit here. And we'll say the name as we kind of go through them, of course, as well. So we can kind of start from the bottom, Tom, if you want, and kind of go up from there. And we can go around a little bit too if you want to start with, mid-tier guys, whatever you want to do there.
Yep, you throw out any player you want, Shayne, and we'll do it. Let's rank these guys.
All right, so we have some. Let's get some of the greats of the past out of the way here first. So right here we have Lynn Swann. We'll start with him. Now for me, and this is just like you'll see if we'll disagree on this. As great as Swann was, right? He had the spectacular plays. He had some of the most like majestic catches in NFL history. The ballet background, all that stuff is great, right? To me, especially if we're comparing receivers all time, his friend right here next to him, John Stallworth, is better in my opinion. A better receiver, was more productive. And Swann, as great as he was, and again, this was a different era, so 1,000 yards is much more attainable nowadays, and even in the 90s and 80s and stuff. But Swann never had 1,000 yards. I think he tapped out about like 800 and something or so as his highest in season total. Obviously made his mark in big games, stuff like that. That's great. I would probably put Swann in the A tier just because the S tier I think needs to be reserved for like the actual greatest players, but also most productive players as well.
Okay, I like your reasoning there, Shayne. I think we're going to touch a nerve probably with some of our listeners here because again, we weren't there to watch these guys live actually, but we've obviously seen games from the 70s. We know all about their stats, all that kind of stuff. I 100% agree with you. I would have Stallworth ranked ahead of Swann. And I think the question that comes next, Shayne, is there's 4 receivers who could potentially be all in that top tier. Depends on how you look at it. I think you can think of them off the top of your head right now. I won't spoil anything, but Stallworth and Swann are obviously 2 among them. I would agree, though. I think that I would put Swann just in that next tier, just below, because of the splash plays, obviously big time plays and big time moments. Played through the four Super Bowls of the 70s. I think that he's right there, though, below a few of the other names on this list. So let's slot him in A, and then we'll go on to the next person.
And I think it's only fair then to start next with John Stallworth himself. And this is the question that I wanted to have is, do you think for our S tier, we should reserve those spots? Because we could have theoretically as many as we want, but we want to make it legitimate. Should we just have the 2 most productive wide receivers in Steelers history, which we all know who those 2 are? Or do you feel comfortable slotting Stallworth right maybe behind those 2 in S tier? Or should he be the front runner of the A tier? That's, I think, the conversation to have with that.
And Shayne, I know I knew before you started exactly where you were going that, because my mind went to the same thing. There's obviously, you could argue that there's 2 in S tier. You could argue that there's 1 in S tier. And so that is a good question. If you guys have a thought here of where we should slot him, drop it in real quick, because we're going to move on. But I think better than we both agree that Stallworth is better than Swan.
He's the better overall receiver, was more productive, obviously.
Yes, it comes down to, do we reserve that top tier? Shayne, I think,
I think for now, what I was going to say was, I think we should slot him and Swan at the front of A tier, and then just kind of let that ride for now, because we'll get to the other S tier guys later. We'll kind of get some of the other guys in between as well. So we'll decide based on where everyone else kind of falls. We might bump Stallworth up to S, but I definitely think he's at least the front runner of A tier for sure.
I like that. Let's do that. And we'll go to the next guy.
So we'll switch these 2. So this is our A tier for now. We can, if you want to get them out of the way and just solidify this kind of top area here, we can just throw the names in there. One of which is very popular, one of which used to be
infamous.
Is more infamous than famous nowadays. Obviously, we're talking about Antonio Brown and Hines Ward, maybe the 2 most different players who could possibly be in the same tier of players. It's very, very funny to talk about that, but I think those 2 are clearly like the S tier receivers. And I just, again, like, I know what we should do if we're talking about individual brilliance, right? I know what is like the right ranking. However, this is greatest wide receivers in Steelers history. And as great as Brown was, Hines Ward does have more like legitimately like championship level moments, things that he did for the franchise. He accomplished more during his time with the franchise overall from like a team and perspective, things like that. So I think it's really just about what order you want to put those 2 in and how good you feel about it.
All right, Shayne. Well, I've got a counter argument, and I want to see what you think about this. I did my greatest wide receivers list, and I won't give that away. If you want to check it out, it's on stillcurtain.com. I actually had Hines Ward as my number 3 receiver behind Stallworth.
Okay.
Because of Stallworth's accolades, because of the 4 Super Bowls, being the top weapon on that. So I would slot Hines Ward in the A tier if it was me. And I'm fine either way, in front of Stallworth, behind Stallworth, but in front of Swan. And I think that top 3 for sure. And all along, like even when I was writing this article, it's like 2 or 3, which is he?
That's
my number 1 is Antonio Brown. And I'm taking all of the sideshow stuff, personality out of this and looking strictly on the field, production, importance to the game. The Steelers had the best offenses we've ever seen with Antonio Brown. And Antonio Brown had one of the best 6-year stretches we've ever seen in the NFL for a wide receiver. He was on a historic pace, like to come in maybe like 3rd behind Jerry Rice and Larry Fitzgerald in receiving, had he not just completely derailed his career when he was still good. And so I would put Brown, for sure, I'd put Brown in the S tier. And I'll let you decide, based on what I just said, Shayne, whether or not you want to put Ward right behind him in the S tier or at the top of the A tier.
I do think it's an interesting discussion to have the Ward versus Stallworth debate, because I think in terms of like individual excellence, I think Stallworth may have been, compared to the rest of the receivers he played with in his era, you could argue he may have been better in his era than Ward was, because as great as Ward was, he was, especially for, outside of a few very well above average seasons for him. He was a little bit of an accumulator in terms of statistically wise, like
it was
average
longevity.
He averaged about 11 yards a catch. Like he was never like this huge play receiver. He was definitely more that were like very reliable. Definitely receiver one for the Steelers for the majority of his career. But it is an interesting discussion with Stallworth and him, because I do think if we want to, and this is why, like I said, Stallworth may move up or down from, well, really only up from here. I do think if we put Ward in A, the question then would become like, do we want to have someone else up there with Brown, and would it then be Stallworth for his era of Steelers football then? Maybe.
Yeah.
Because that's the fun conversation with them. I think for now, I'm going to put Hines right kind of where you had him for now. Okay. And then we'll kind of debate about like whether Stallworth should come up, should Brown be by himself in terms of just like his individual excellence as a receiver, and we'll kind of come back from there.
Yeah, and for the record, I like Hines Ward better than Antonio Brown. I'm actually
I like him more.
Yeah, because of the way things ended and because of just we want to get into it. I'm glad that Brown didn't surpass Hines Ward as the Steelers' all-time leading receiver.
Yes.
But I think that it's unquestionably at the prime of their career, their impact as an actual receiver, Brown's was, I think, unmatched compared to the rest of the group. Now, Ward, obviously the better blocker, the just unmatched physicality, and was huge during the Super Bowl runs of the 2000s. So that matters a lot too. So that's why I think those are the four. If you have them in a different order, drop your order down to us in the live chat here, and we're going to move on to the next player.
Yeah, and I think the next guy that would make a lot of sense to go to if we're going to stick, especially with some of the older guys, we have Louis Lips right here. And for me, it's interesting because if you look at the Steelers' all-time receiving leaders, right? If you just look at yards, after Stallworth, in terms of actual receiving yards, it's not Swan, it's Lips at 6,000, about 6,000. Now, obviously, I don't think Lips was as good as Swan. I think Swan was definitely the better football player overall and the better receiver, but just played in a little bit of an older era, obviously, and didn't play with, and Lips didn't have the problem of playing with a guy that was clearly better than him in Stallworth. So I think that is a situation where you could argue Lips just being higher than him doesn't mean he's obviously better than him. But I'm curious, like, should we start, like, should the A tier maybe be done with? And we have, because most of these other guys we're going to talk about, they had their moments as Steelers, but there's not a ton of other like true high-end wide receivers that play for the Steelers for a huge length of time, right? So that's what I kind of wanted to present. Like, do you think Lips is one of those guys that could still sneak into A, or do we want to kind of start our B tier rankings here?
Yeah, it's a perfectly fair question because of Lips's production. He obviously didn't have the benefit of playing with that amazing team of the 70s. He was in the 80s and 90s when the Steelers weren't so good.
No.
But I 100% think, Shayne, that the A tier is done. I think those are the four.
That's kind of what I thought.
And I think it drops off after that. So I would put him atop of the B tier.
Right. That's what I was going to say as well, because I think the Steelers, again, we're known for something, and it ain't necessarily throwing the football, at least not for a lot of our history. Right? So, like, we're not going to have a ton of guys who are in that 7, 8, 9,000 range receiver-wise and yards-wise. So we're starting to look at guys who are very good for us, but maybe not ever a superstar in any form.
And oddly enough, this team is known for drafting and developing wide receivers
nowadays,
in the early to mid rounds. But they just historically haven't thrown all that much other than that like 6-7 year stretch in the Roethlisberger era when they were pass happy.
Right, exactly.
So,
looking at some other guys we have here that are a little bit down the way here. So older players here. We got next. I wanted to throw out Yancey Thigpen's name.
Okay.
Because he only 3,600 career yards for the Steelers specifically, right? But his only 2 1,000-yard seasons. Let me pull it up. I wanted to bring it up here. His only 2,000-yard seasons he had, and they were both 1,300-yard seasons for the Steelers. So he had 2 high-end production years with the Steelers came with us, right? So he had 1,300 yards 2 different times. So you could say his 2 best seasons are probably better than even Lips' best seasons with us. But obviously he played a little bit later as well, I believe. So I think he would also be a B tier guy for me just because he did have super productive seasons while he was a Steeler.
Yeah, I think the challenge we're going to find here, Shayne, is that fine line between the B and C tier, because I think we've established the other ones pretty well. But yeah, I think once you get there, it's hard. But I agree with you. I would put him in the B tier as well. Maybe not next in line in the B tier. I think there's going to be
There's
maybe
other
a couple
guys
names that will slide ahead of him. But let's slot him in the B tier.
And I also want to make the kind of a little bit of an argument where his season in between his 2 1,300-yard seasons was cut short due to injury. So you could be looking at 3 consecutive 1,000+ yard seasons for in an era where you're in the mid 90s. This is kind of when the Cowher era was starting, and we're getting into that era where they're starting to kind of get up to relevance again a little bit, whereas they were really out of it for the 80s especially. So yeah, I think he definitely could have been even higher on this list than he's going to be, but I think for what he did show, I want to put him in B for now, obviously. And then we also have, unfortunately, I think it was about a year and a half ago, Charles Johnson passed away. I know at 50 years old due to some issues. He's on here as well as one of the guys who are a little bit before, especially my time. I wanted to pull up his numbers again here because he's a guy that I do believe also had a 1,000-yard season for us during his time here. I wanted to pull that up again.
Yeah, he did have one, I believe.
Yes, I think he had one as well, yeah. And 4,600 career yards, most of which came with the Steelers. He did have in his third season had 1,000 yards. So he's one of those guys too where I think maybe is where he's probably more of a C-tier guy. Realistically,
he gets a bad rap, Shayne, because of being a first-round pick that didn't really pan out for them. Got off to a slow start to his career. So yeah, definitely not on the Lewis Lips, Yancey Thigpen level. We're not talking about that type of player. So I would say C. Let's put him C for now. I think D is probably being a little bit too harsh for the player that he was. But let's find out where we get these rankings, and if we got to drop them, then we'll drop them one more.
For sure. Yeah, I think that's kind of where I'm at with him too, where good player overall, but just didn't live up to the hype. Obviously, that doesn't help, and only had the one super productive year for us. So, and then that kind of gets I wanted to limit some of the older players just because, again, like I don't want to be the one to say that other than the guys we clearly know enough about to rank, like the Swans, the Stalwarts and stuff. Because you look at the list and there's some guys in like the 50s who are averaging like 20 yards a catch when forward pass was like sort of cool, but not really. So looking at our next kind of tier of guys here, some definitely recent guys, some guys who had, honestly more success outside of Pittsburgh, but still were good players for the Steelers. Let's get Plaxico Burress out of the way here.
Okay.
Burress is an interesting one because obviously kind of, you won a Super Bowl with the Giants, when he left the Steelers. He was pretty productive overall with the Steelers. I mean, 4,200 yards in his career with the Steelers. I think that he had in his career with us specifically, it was 2,000-yard seasons in the second and third season. Started to tail off a little bit at the end there, missed some time in his last season before going to the Giants. So I want to put him in B tier because of the big plays and kind of the high-end play that we saw from him at times. I think he's definitely in that tier of player for me.
Plexico was good. Like I think
was really good.
This is a guy who would have signed a second contract and a big contract extension with the Steelers. We would be looking at him higher historically
for us
because his career with the Giants was really impressive.
Yeah,
like when he was not suspended and when he was healthy and playing, he was really good. He's had multiple 1,000-yard seasons, and his numbers by the end of his career looked really good. I'm surprised he actually didn't get more personal accolades than what he did. I think it was only 1 or 2 Pro Bowls maybe in his whole career.
I believe you're right.
Player, so
yeah, he was. Gets the Super Bowl, which is good for him. But
I like where you put him, Shayne.
Yeah, I think that's the right.
I like that spot for him. And you just didn't get many receivers like him either. 6'5" and he was 235 pounds. Like that was a big receiver who can go up and get the ball, just win with just pure size and length, and just outmatch people down the field. So
for sure,
I like that.
Absolutely. And then we have, again, we're getting into some newer guys now, especially. I wanted to throw this guy out next because I'm curious. Like, I think I know where I would put him as a player, but I think his perception, because of some of the big plays he made and some of the fun stuff we did with him, I think his perception's a little bit higher than the actual production was. But Antoine Randall, I threw on the list here. I do think he's a C-tier guy. Just because, again, like, and you could argue, like, maybe because of some of the cool moments he had, maybe put him at the top of C tier for now until we kind of get some more guys in here. But he wasn't as productive as people probably would guess. He is, for the Steelers specifically, he had only 2,200 receiving yards.
Yeah.
But
Shayne, I couldn't agree with you more on this one. And because I know a lot of people, they think Antoine Randall, you think the Super Bowl pass. He did have some really big plays, really big moments.
Mm-hmm.
He was more of a gadget player than he was like a true wide receiver. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. No. It's just he wasn't that productive. There were other receivers there who took on a lot bigger roles than what he had. He was kind of a slot and gadget option who really wasn't productive. But I agree with you. I would slot him over Johnson, but in the C tier. I don't believe that I would bump him up to the B tier because of the lack of production.
Yeah, he just
it was only 4 years with the was 4 years with the Steelers. Played a bunch with Washington, then came back for one final year with the Steelers.
Yeah. He hung around for a while, but actually, I think his most productive season was in Washington. Overall. So, but again, he was a guy that people know of him because of the Steelers, right? Like if you think of Steelers receivers, he's going to come up.
Steelers receivers in the Super Bowl era is why.
Yeah, he's going to come up relatively quickly. So I needed to make sure we kind of gave him his flowers a little bit.
I agree with your take on that, though. I think some will probably have him higher than what we do, but I think that on the scope of things, when you compare him to these other receivers, I think that he's a C tier.
Gotcha. Now, here's a guy that I think is going to, especially because he's one of the most recent guys that's going to be on this list, other than someone who currently plays for us still, that I threw on here just for fun. Deontay Johnson. So, for me, he is solidly, very comfortably a B tier player. And I would even argue because of the length of time and the amount of times he was this team's leading receiver, kind of helped us get through the Antonio Brown transition a lot, alongside, obviously Juju for a little bit there. He should be pretty up there in B tier, especially because you look at where he ended up ranking on Steelers all-time list of receivers. He does have a little bit more yards than Plaxico. Didn't have quite the same explosive seasons that Plaxico did for us and also for the Giants, but this guy, when he was healthy, he was always getting the football for this team. He was their go-to guy. So I definitely want to put him in B. Now, where specifically you want to put him, I'd be comfortable putting him either right behind or right in front of Plaxico. It's really personal preference, but I do think he's a B tier player for the Steelers at receiver.
This one's interesting for me, Shayne, and I disagree with you a little bit.
Okay.
Not that he shouldn't be a B tier receiver, but I would definitely have him behind those three that are in the B tier. I'd have him behind Lips for sure.
I'd
have him behind Plaxico, and I think I'd have him behind Yancey. And my thought is not that you have to move him yet. Let's just you hear it out, and then I'll let you decide what you want to do.
Gotcha.
I think Deontay, although he didn't play with good quarterbacks, he did have the advantage of being kind of the only receiver in Pittsburgh for a while, and targets were just funneled through him. It wasn't that he was necessarily overly efficient. We knew about the drop issues. Obviously, his career was an actual roller coaster ride. He had one amazing 10-game stretch. Which year was that? 2021, I want to say it was.
Yeah,
and then he just was horrible the rest of that year, had a bad year the next year. So he was so up and down to me that even though he did have a lot of catches, a lot of raw production, I don't think he was quite as good of an overall football player as these guys. Better than Randall L, because obviously he was the X receiver, the team's number one guy. So he was relied on far more. But I think I would have him lower in the B tier. I think I'd have him just a fringe B tier on the edge, but still in the B tier category. So you don't have to move it on my account, but if anybody has a chat in here they want to drop where they think he should be, go ahead and slide it in.
I do think looking at the overall numbers for him in Thigpen, it is interesting because Thigpen only had 222 catches, whereas Deontay had 391, right? Mm-hmm. So in terms of the volume, obviously Deontay blows him out. However, he only has about 700 less receiving yards than Deontay did as a Steeler. So you could certainly make the argument that Thigpen was the bigger play receiver, especially, and maybe the more impactful one, based in his offense, opposed to Deontay, where again, Deontay was kind of, for good reason, he was getting the football a lot, but it was partially, like you said, because who else was going to get the football for a while there. So
yeah, I think that's part of it. And again, I know that he didn't have the best quarterback play to work with. Right. So maybe if he's with Roethlisberger for a longer portion of his career, maybe he's a much more efficient player. So there's that factor as well. But what I would say too is if you look at approximate value from Pro Football Reference, Yancey Thigpen's approximate value is 38. Johnson's is 36. And so they're very close. And approximate value, for those who don't know, that's Pro Football Reference assigns a number based on the value they believe that player attributed to the team that year. And so very close in terms of their career value for the Steelers. I would have Yancey. I think I would have it the way that it looks right now. And so in the B tier order, Lips, Burris, Yancey, and then I'd have Deontay.
Gotcha. Okay, I do think that that's probably the most likely thing in terms of like being realistic about it. Is having him there. I did want to real quick before we move on to the next guy. Yeah, I thought so. Okay, so this is going to be an interesting conversation because the two guys I want to talk about next year is Martavis Bryant and Chase Claypool.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, Bryant had some spectacular moments with us. He had his issues off the field, and that's why it didn't last longer and other things. But who would you guess, and maybe you know this because you did your list, like who would you guess has more career receiving yards for the Steelers?
Because you said that, I'm going to go that it's Claypool.
It's
the reverse psychology thing.
Exactly. It is
yes.
barely, but it is indeed Chase Claypool by a little bit. He has him beat by, I think, a couple hundred yards, if I'm not mistaken. It was, yes. So Martavis had 1,917, which does not feel right for the amount of like big plays he made specifically. And then Chase ended up with 2,044. And obviously a lot of that coming in his first season with the team. So I wanted to I feel like that's the problem is I feel like Martavis I would put in C because of how dominant he was when he was playing for us. Like I don't think he's a D tier player. Whereas Chase I would put in D because I feel like outside of his rookie season, he was dreadful at times for this team.
Yes.
That's kind of where I'm at.
Shayne, I have got a soft spot for Martavis Bryant. Yep. Like I think this guy, he was overshadowed by Antonio Brown, and rightfully so. Brown was amazing. Bryant, when he was on the field, not suspended, and this guy was playing, he was so good. Like the splits, the point differential when he's on the field, how his impact on Antonio Brown and his efficiency and production when he was on the field. He was arguably the best deep threat in the league during that stretch while he was with the Steelers, and doing that at 6'4", no less. And so I really liked him when he played. The Steelers offense was a top 3 offense in the NFL most of the time. Obviously, the longevity factors into this. He couldn't stay with the team. He couldn't avoid being suspension because he was always getting suspended for performance or for substance abuse. He eventually was obviously traded to the Raiders for the 3rd round pick. His career went downhill and suspended indefinitely by the NFL. And his career was just mush after that. So if this guy would have been able to stay here, I think that he skyrockets easily into the B tier. Like, I don't think there's any question. Like the career track that he was on in Martavis's first, I want to say it was his first 18. Don't quote me on this, but I did the stat the other day. His first 18 games, he had like 1,400 yards and 1,400 yards and 15 touchdowns. Like it was really good, really good. So his problem is he couldn't play a full season because he was getting suspended, but his value to the team as a 6'4" receiver who could, he had no business being as good as he was after the catch. Like it's just, it was unreal to see him move after the catch the way he did. Some of the combated catches he came down. Obviously, everybody knows the one where he pulls it against his hamstring,
flipped upside down, and
back of the end zone, and just the gazelle strides, just blowing past cornerbacks down the field. Like I think the collection of his traits could have made him a potentially special player, but because his career was so short lived, I would say in the C tier, and where would you slot him in the C tier? I think for sure in the C tier. I'm not putting him with Claypool. He's better player than Claypool, in my opinion. And so I would put him for sure in the C tier. I would have him. Who's that last player? I can't see.
So it's Martavis right now. Charles Johnson and Antoine Randall. So
yeah, I think
he's the least productive of these three, but
for sure he was
definitely better in his play, like in the plays he had for us was better than these two. So it's like,
I think that just goes how you weigh it. Like the peak, I think was for sure better than either of those guys. It's just the longevity was so short.
That's
he never played a full season with the Steelers. So I'm okay leaving him where he is right now. In fact, in my article, Shayne, of the 20 best Steelers receivers of all time, I did not include Martavis. I had him as an honorable mention, almost
just didn't play enough.
He actually didn't meet the criteria of playing that full season, but I think that he would have met it with flying colors had he been able to stay clean and stay on the field. So I'm okay with leaving him right where he is there.
Perfect. Okay. And then I have two guys who I think we're going to end up putting in the D tier just because C, I think, is a little bit too rich for them, both because of the length of time and also just the lack of production overall while they were there. Marcus Wheaton A guy who did have 2 solid seasons, but outside of that, did absolutely nothing in the NFL.
Yeah.
He had 2 like 600-700 yard seasons or so after
Yeah.
his first season, then fell off a cliff, just stopped existing pretty
Mhm.
much. And then James Washington, who did have a couple good moments for us, but I don't know if I'd put him in a C tier just because I don't think he did enough as a Steeler to be a C tier player.
I agree with you on that. I think both of those guys are D tier players right there with Claypool. And ordering them is interesting
It's
because
tough.
Claypool had the really impressive rookie year
Yeah.
and then was just so unreliable after that. Washington was somewhat reliable, somewhat unspectacular. Had a really bad rookie year, if I recall, like caught like 13 of 33 passes.
Something like that.
Terrible ratio. And then he leads the Steelers in receiving in 2019 without Ben Roethlisberger, just Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges slinging him the ball. His yards per target were awesome. I think he was pushing 10 yards a target that year. Did nothing after that, and he was kind of just washed out of the league. Tried to stick him with the Cowboys there, and then had the Liz Frank injury. And then Wheaton, I think my brain always goes back. I can vividly remember that 200-yard game against Seattle. I'm like, where did that come from? Wheaton, like on paper, should have been better than what he was. He was like, he's a really good athlete, just couldn't make it work. And so I'll put it up to you, Shane. How would you order those three names?
So my problem with it is I think you have to put Chase at the front of D tier because he's the most productive of these three and did it in less games than those.
Probably will have the longest career too, even if he's just bouncing around.
Right. Yeah. I think he still was the most productive overall for the Steelers in terms of yardage, despite playing less games than those other two did. So that to me is enough to leave him. I want to put him in D tier because if I don't, I'm going to lose my mind. But I think he belongs to, at least for now, be the front of D tier. So we'll see. But we have a couple more guys here that are kind of fringe-ish players to me.
Okay.
Because it depends on, because we're talking about them as Steelers wide receivers. I wanted to put Emmanuel Sanders here because he's more known for his time with the Broncos, especially, right? And then bounced around a little bit with the Niners and Saints, I think. And
great NFL career, but with the Steelers, he really wasn't that efficient at all.
Yeah, he really wasn't. He is higher on the list than a couple guys who are like Chase Claypool is just barely above him, things like that. But I do think he was a good player for us, so I'd want to put him like somewhere in C tier, but just didn't break out because of roadblocks with the Steelers until he went to the Broncos. So.
Yeah, Shane, I think where you have him in C tier is correct. That's where I think it's behind Martavis because Martavis's highs were way higher.
His highs with the Steelers specifically.
Like Sanders was kind of frustrating actually as a Steelers player. They tried to kind of use him as a deep threat. They used him out of position a little bit. Obviously, Antonio Brown emerged, and so from the same draft class. But Sanders just was not efficient with them at all. He just couldn't connect. Him and Roethlisberger were never on the same page. It seemed like Martavis was a way more impactful player, so I would definitely put him behind Martavis, but I think the C tier, I think that's warranted.
I still just think he's a better player than again. I do think part of it was the way he was used with us was more of an issue than his talent level. Obviously, as we saw what he did once he left the Steelers. So to me, I think it's fair to put him at the back end of C for what he did with us, but also giving a little bit of credit because we know how good he actually was. It just needed to be somewhere else. So
I'm good with that.
Yeah, definitely. And then this is another guy that's going to be a little bit difficult. I feel like to kind of categorize because honestly, just look at the picture. Santonio Holmes, right?
That picture says it all. That's worth 1,000 words.
That's kind of the thing, right? Is if you look at the Steelers list of receiving leaders, I wanted to pull him up here again. He is relatively up there. He's I believe 14th with about 3,800 yards. He has, let's just say, he has maybe the biggest play by any Steeler receiver ever, especially as good as the other players have been. He caught the game-winning catch in the Super Bowl spectacularly, right? It wasn't just, I'm going to run a slant and win. He caught a spectacular throw from Ben, but also an unbelievable job keeping his feet in bounds in the situation. For me, I feel like you kind of have to put him in B somewhere because of that. If you'd love to put him in A for what he did, but you can't do that, I don't think. And I think with the problem with B is he's less productive than all the other guys in B, but he made the biggest play by far of any of those guys.
Yeah.
B. So where do you what do you think with that?
Yeah, and just for clarity for our audio listeners, the picture that we're referring to is the toe tap touchdown by Santonio Holmes, the game-winning touchdown in Super Bowl 43 there. So, yeah, Shane, I agree with you. I think he has to be there because without that play and without that drive, really, I mean, he was Super Bowl MVP because of that. The Steelers have one fewer Super Bowl right now. And so I think B tier for sure.
I feel like in the
go
middle
ahead.
here, maybe. Right now,
Okay.
for now, we can move him, but I have him slotted in the middle.
Shayne, man, I'm tempted to go just above Plaxico.
That's
honestly,
the question. That's really the question for me. Is he above him? Because I think on the field,
I would say lower than Lips for sure.
Yeah.
But I think I would put him higher than Plaxico and the other guys in B tier here. So I think that's where I would go, just because those moments were so big.
He wasn't great
during the regular season. Very, very average during the regular season, but the postseason stuff was really impressive.
Overall, their production isn't that different from each other. And like in terms of for the Steelers. So I do think that when you factor in that moment and some of the plays, he made some big plays in the playoffs for us during his time. And, you talk about big moments and big games. He was one of those guys that had that reputation for the Steelers for sure.
Yeah.
So I think that it's fair to put him, right where he's at, right in the.
And I think that's justified, Shayne. When we're doing this ranking criteria, you have to consider these big moments, and I did these in my articles too. You have to consider big moments in ranking criteria, not just we can't just go off of one set. We can't go by receiving yards. We can't go by just approximate value.
Yeah.
It's a collection of things that we're using here to determine these rankings. Obviously, they're very subjective as well. But I think that because that drive and that play literally won the Steelers another Super Bowl, not taking anything away from Ben, who a lot of people thought should have been MVP still because of that game-winning drive as well. But Santonio, they're not getting to that 6th Super Bowl without that.
Right. And I think John kind of said it best, and I appreciate it. Ability, luck, timing, and attitude are all variables that count in the rankings. And that's what we're trying to do. And again, that's all being said with the fact that AB is still number 1 on our list because of how just dominant he was. It's really hard to argue that. Everything else, though, I think is very much up for debate. But a couple more guys who are very interesting. Nate Washington, I want to throw in.
Okay.
Just because I think he's a guy, for me especially, and that's one of the guys we did for Guess the Steeler that you got very quickly. I was very impressed. He's a guy that was more productive for the Titans than the Steelers, but I thought he was a really good Steelers receiver. I think he's definitely a C tier guy for me for that.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. I would definitely put him in the C tier.
I think I'd rather put him over. I think I'd put him over Sanders, but not over the other guys because
he was better than Sanders. Sanders obviously had the better NFL career, but we're looking at Steelers career obviously here for these rankings. I would put Washington ahead of Sanders, and agreed. I'd leave him behind Martavis. Martavis his peak was just way better than what Washington. Washington was a really solid, a high end 3, a low end 2, and I think that's kind of what he was. A solid, reliable player, but. I think we got him in the right spot there.
Yeah, Washington, to his credit, did finish with almost 7,000 receiving yards in his career.
It is impressive.
Very, very productive Titans career. He had a couple really big years for them, and that definitely helped him out. Again, Steelers only here. So the next guy I wanted to do is Juju, because he is such an interesting one to me. Because if you look at, again, he's ahead of a lot of the guys that we've talked about on this list in terms of production for the Steelers. The problem is, there's a lot of people who talk about him in a way of was he just an Antonio Brown merchant? Was he a guy that just was the other receiver with Antonio Brown? And he made a lot of great plays on his own, like the long touchdowns in his first couple of years, the big plays after the catch, the just toughness that he displayed. I'm kind of on the fringe of putting him either at the top of C or end of B. I think he's in that range. I think his best seasons are better than a lot of the guys even in B, but I think his total career, he had some injuries, his production dropped off once AB was gone. I think that has to be considered, but I think he's firmly in that beginning of C, end of B tier.
Okay, well, I'll help you make that decision, Shayne. I would put him at the end of the B tier.
Okay, I kind of agree.
Anytime a receiver has a 1,400-yard season,
it's
Antonio
really
Brown
hard.
is across from you or not.
Yeah, it was
impressive.
It's really hard.
He was so efficient back then. Now the problem with Juju obviously was that he kind of fizzled out pretty quickly there.
Yeah.
Now the first 2 years, awesome. 900 and some yards, 900 yards and 6 touchdowns, I want to say, as a rookie, 1,400 yards the next year. I mean, that is collectively 2 really good years to start your career. Then it was like walking down a set of stairs after that. Every year the production dropped until the last year before leaving the Steelers. It was like 4.7, 4.9 yards per target, which is that's worse than dumping the ball off to a backup running back.
Yeah, it was bad.
But what he did early on was impressive enough. Now, counter argument here, and I might catch some flack for this. I think for sure when Martavis was on the field, his impact to the team was more valuable than Juju. The problem is the best ability is availability, and Martavis didn't have it. So that's why he's in the tier that he's in. So I think that Juju belongs in that tier with Deontay Johnson. And I think you could flip either direction. I think that Johnson, even with his inconsistencies, was probably more reliable overall than Juju. And Juju kind of just got faded out to being just like this underwhelming slot receiver towards the end of his Steelers career. Didn't last very long. And obviously, even if we were counting what he's done since then, it's been nothing, essentially. So one decent year with the Chiefs, and that's about it. So I think that where you have him is perfectly fair.
Yeah, I think that I would put him behind Deontay just because Deontay was more consistently effective. He didn't sway.
And the X receiver, I think that that guy that can create separation and win against man coverage. So I do think that Juju was never really, in my mind, he was never really a wide receiver one. He was always he was high-end wide receiver two. Even when he was super productive, it's like, can he be the wide receiver one? And he proved that he couldn't be. He was just that wide receiver two, which still ended up being a great pick for the Steelers. But I think that's probably where I'd slot him as well.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at too. And then two guys who are very interesting to talk about. One currently on the team, and one who is been out of football for a little while, but was very productive for us. I will start with Mike Wallace here because I feel like leaving the guy that's currently with us and just kind of because I want to do with him kind of projection a little bit of what do we think he's gonna end up looking like a little bit as well. But I want to finish off before we talk about George with Mike Wallace, and he's really tough for me because he was very, very, very good as a deep threat for this team. Very, very good. And he obviously did a lot of damage elsewhere. He was a Raven too, which for some people might be a black spot on his resume a little bit. Had some production for the Dolphins as well. He's kind of a weird guy to rank for me because I firmly think he's a top of B tier level player, right? I think he certainly is. But it's how much credit do we give him in a Steelers uniform compared to his overall career, right? Because Santonio certainly was similarly productive overall, but also had the big moment that he doesn't have. Was he better than Plaxico was for us? I think that's kind of what I want to talk about with him.
Shayne, I really liked Mike Wallace.
I did too.
I loved his impact on the field. I know that he was a body catcher at times. I know that he wasn't the most complete route runner, but when you've got sub 4.3 speed at 6'1", and you can torch people down the field, which is what he did at a higher level than anybody else in the league at that time. It was him, Deshaun Jackson. He was one of the best deep threats in the entire league for a good stretch for 4 or 5 years of his career. And he had that 3-year stretch with the Steelers where I think he averaged over 1,100 yards and had a lot of touchdowns too. You got to put the ball in the end zone, and he certainly did that. I can recall a couple of those game winners off the top of my head. The one where Ben scrambles around a little bit, finds Wallace in the side of the end zone there with no time left. He had big moments. He had big plays. The yards per catch were phenomenal. The yards per target were phenomenal. I think he helped Ben take his game to the next level.
His first big leap
in that conversation.
Yeah, his first big leap.
The big leap. Now he already had some of the reputation obviously before that with the Super Bowl early in his career. But I think he helped him take that to the next level to say this is a top tier passer now, be a top 5 quarterback in the league. I personally, Shayne, I might even slot him. I might slot him just ahead of Santonio. I think that his impact
on the field overall.
Regular season impact was clearly better than Santonio. It just depends on how much you weigh that Super Bowl drive of Holmes.
That's the problem. I think if we're being honest about it, Santonio makes it from the top of C to this part of B because of his Super Bowl run and because of what he did in the playoffs at times. But I think you can only take that so far, right? I think because of what Wallace was, he was unlike some of the other guys in the B tier. He had a defined, he was one of those very best at what he did in the NFL for a period of time. Whereas you weren't really saying, Plaxico, you could say the big, the 50-50 balls and stuff like that. You could make that argument with him a little bit. But outside of that, no one else on that list was really considered one of the very best at what they did in their role in the NFL. So I think you can put Wallace ahead of Santonio for that reason.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of the first time in ages that the Steelers had an elite passing offense, and I think that Wallace had a lot to do with that. So I agree. I think I'd slot him right where we have him, the second player in B tier there.
Yeah, And the last one, and I want to talk about a little bit because, again, I want us to use a little, because there's just not enough sample size to like make a full evaluation yet of what he's going to be for the Steelers, but use a little bit of like what he's done, what we think he might do as well. George Pickens, I did throw on the list here. So here's what I'm going to say. I think that if he continues to play at the level he's played at, and the Steelers, especially if the Steelers were to re-sign him to a contract extension or sign him to a contract extension, he has a chance to be up there in A. Like, that's the type of talent we're talking about. Now, whether that happens or not is going to be largely dependent on his attitude and like how much better he gets as a teammate and as a leader. Like, can he be the receiver for this team long term? I think, again, talent-wise, I'm not really questioning that at all. But I'd struggle where I want to place him for the time being, because his season last year and just some of the plays he's able to make. Like, if we're talking about ability, kind of the Martavis Bryant conversation, right? Where there's not a lot of production yet. There wasn't a lot of production with Bryant. You hope there's a lot more with Pickens, but again, not right now. I mean, you look at his ranking, though, if you look at the Steelers all-time receivers, he's already, like, if we're looking at total production, I wanted to pull him up here. He has, where's that here? He's already outproduced Martavis Bryant, right?
Yeah.
In 2 seasons.
Yeah.
Now, again, he's played where Bryant didn't play a lot, but he's almost at 2,000 yards after 2 seasons. He's just a freak of nature. I hesitate to put him very high, obviously, because he's only had 2 seasons, but his trajectory is about as good as a lot of the other guys who are at the top of B and into A.
Yeah, Shane, the only person who's going to stand in George Pickens' way is George Pickens.
Pretty much.
He can be as good as he allows himself to be if he can keep his emotions in check, if he is willing to block on a play-to-play basis. Like, we saw those things, and that's what has people concerned about his longevity with the team. Will he get that second contract? Because it's going to be huge. Like, at this rate, the guy's averaged almost 1,000 receiving yards over his first 2 seasons. Last year, he had 1,140 yards,
offense.
5 touchdowns. Bad offenses, bad quarterback play. And Pickens, just to show you how impressive he's been, despite playing with Kenny Pickett and Matt Canada's offense and Mitch Trubisky and Mason Rudolph, 10.2 average career yards per target, not yards per reception. Every time you throw to this guy, he averages a first down. Like, Pickens has been really good. That's an elite NFL number. Like, that would be an awesome historic number if he retired today. Now, I don't know if that will keep up the rest of his career. As he gets more targets per season, that number could go down, obviously. The volume factors into that. But Pickens has been undeniably good. Is he the best route runner? No, he's not. He's not there yet. He showed a lot of potential after the catch, stuff that we really didn't see much of at Georgia when it was just flies and comebacks. Last year was very encouraging. You saw the play in the Bengals game from Mason Rudolph. You can take a simple post pattern, outrun everybody to the end zone with the ball, and like 82-yard catch and 86-yard catch and run. Like, he has untapped potential at 6'3.25". Can jump out of the roof. I don't care what his vertical said at the combine. He's way more athletic than what he tested. Just like CeeDee Lamb didn't test as a good athlete. CeeDee Lamb is a great athlete on the field. So your on-field athleticism matters more than your testing numbers. Ran a 4.47 for what it's worth. But to do all the things that he can do at that size and the catches we've seen him make, I mean, his spectacular catches in traffic are on par with anything that we've seen probably in the past decade in the NFL. Like, they are right up there. The sky is the limit for him. 2-year sample size. So when we're going back to this ranking now, clearly ahead of the D. I would say he's ahead of those guys in the C unit. I think that it depends on. I think he's B, Shane, and I don't disagree with you. I think that he is that guy that has that potential to be an A player. It just depends on how high will he allow himself to go. How will he mature? Will he be that leader, that number one receiver they need him to be? Where would you slot him, Shane? And then I'll give you my thoughts.
So I think what I would want to do is I would at least want to slot him ahead of Juju, because Juju was never going to be a true outside wide receiver one. I think you could also argue Deontay a little bit, only because we saw him overtake him as this team's wide receiver one last year. And part of that was injuries. But again, we saw him be the alpha in that room as recently as this past season when Deontay was still there and when he was healthy. So to me, I think you can make the argument just because you're also projecting a little bit, and also like as much as Deontay was next wide receiver, Pickens is he's the prototypical X wide receiver. Like this is what you want from a guy like that. I at least would want to put him ahead of Juju, but I would also be willing, like I said, to put him ahead of Deontay.
Yeah, for what it's worth, Shayne, I have them touching on my all-time rankings, and these are going to be updated annually, and I fully expect to move him ahead of Deontay after this season. Now, the reason in my criteria why I had Deontay Johnson higher for now was because of the longevity, because he had hundreds of catches, and he's done that for 5 years in Pittsburgh. I have no issue at all slotting him ahead of Deontay because I fully expect to be there early in this season. Like, I think he's going to be that guy for them. So again, his ceiling is dependent on him. I think that's the best way to put it. But I think that he could pass all those guys in the B tier. And I think that you feel the same way, Shayne, but I think that's good for now. I think it's probably a little bit rich. Obviously it is rich to say, Plexico's had a lot more of it. It's all had the multiple 1,000-yard seasons. Same with Yancey. And so I think where we have him in the B tier, I think it is totally respectable. With the ability to move higher and potentially crack that top 5 receiver list in NFL history. Like, so to just recap here, we've got Antonio in the superstar tier by himself because of his absolute dominance, being considered one of the best non-quarterbacks in the entire NFL for a 6-year stretch in the league. All of his accolades, they're enough to be a Hall of Famer if he gets in, if he's likable enough to get voted in here. The A tier is John Stallworth first, and then Hines Ward and Lynn Swann. That's it. Those are the top 4 receivers. Then we bump down to the B tier here. We've got Lewis Lips, Mike Wallace, Santonio Holmes, Plexico Burris. I'm squinting here at the players.
I got you. It's Yancey Thigpen next after him, and then you got George Pickens with a little bit of a caveat if we expect him to get to here basically this year coming up, and then maybe go up from here. Deontay Johnson, Juju Smith-Schuster to round out B tier. C tier, we have Antoine Randall for kind of his reputation and what he was able to do in Super Bowls a little bit, or the Super Bowl. We have Charles Johnson. We have Martavis Bryant, Nate Washington, and Emmanuel Sanders. And then the D tier, some guys who you know who they are, but they weren't exactly the most memorable guys, or if they were memorable in Claypool's case, it was for the wrong reasons oftentimes. Chase Claypool, James Washington, and Marcus Wheaton.
All right, Shayne. And if we would have added Limas Sweed and Sammy Coates, we would have needed another tier.
Oh, yeah, we need a tier below that. Yeah, for sure.
We don't have enough time in a podcast for those guys.
No, we don't.
All right, that is our show for today. If you guys enjoyed following along with us there, let us know in the comments. If we bored your ear off, let us know that as well, because we want to know what to do with you guys in the future. And obviously, we did this during a slower time. Next week, we will do a full training camp preview. I'm excited to get to that because that will be right when training camp is going to be kicking off and players are going to be coming into the facility there at St. Vincent College for Steelers training camp. So we're going to have a lot to talk about here soon. Thank you again for joining us on the show. We go live every single Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. Also, please check out Josh Yoris's show on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. He does an amazing job. He often has a special guest on his show. Learn a lot from those. So check those out as well. Thank you for joining us on the show today. You can follow Shayne on Twitter at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on Twitter at Tommy Jaggi. You can download the Steel Curtain podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also, check us out on YouTube or ask Alexa to play the Steel Curtain podcast. And thanks again for listening to the Steel Curtain podcast.